Welcome to this edition of our weekly webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger, China. In point of fact, this is a little bit different than our normal fare, as we are going to combine forces with another team sponsored by our committee and its sponsor, that is to say, the Institute for the American Future. You can learn more about all that is done by that organization and these particular parts of it as well at usfuture.org. We're going to combine forces between the committee and the Victory Coalition, an outfit that has been created for the purposes of urging that the United States accept no substitute for victory, in particular in conflicts with sharia-supremacists and regimes like that of Iran that is imbued with its ambitions for world domination and the destruction of our country. An agenda that it happens to also share with the Chinese Communist Party, as do others in that Sharia supremacist bloc, notably the nations of Turkey and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Three nations that we are routinely told are allies of ours, but in point of fact are in most respects not only hostile and often uncooperative, but actually indeed committed to the replacement of the present world order, the replacement of the government of the United States in particular as a principal enabler of that world order, with Sharia, the agenda of Sharia supremacists, as I say, of both the Shia and the Sunni stripe. We're going to talk about what it means for all of that, specifically a world order that the dictator of communist China, Xi Jinping, has in mind, which is not the same arrangement as do these Sharia folks, but they do share an immediate common purpose, and that is getting rid of the obstacle to their respective ambitions, namely the United States of America. Our purpose today is to examine what impact an agreement that was struck just recently between the governments of Turkey and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to have a mutual defense arrangement. We're going to get different perspectives on the nature of, and especially the improbable durability of such a pact, but specifically what it means for a party that is not yet implicated in all of it directly, but is clearly behind the scenes very much a player, and that would be the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping. The CCP, as we call it, has been very much involved in essentially colonizing those three nations to varying degrees. It has a very prominent stake, I think it is fair to say, in all three, and aspires to essentially govern their affairs, at least on the international scene, to the extent it can, in support of the ambitions of Xi. And as we will talk about with some of those who are among the foremost experts in this country about the Chinese communists, what is the larger likelihood that Xi's agenda of world domination and what we call World War Xi to achieve it will be furthered by this pact between three of its vassal states? So let's get to it. We're going to hear first from a man who often kicks off these conversations, a very good friend of the committee, of which he has been a founding member, as well as, I think, the Victory Coalition and its clarity about the need for decisive victory. Captain James Fennell is his name. He couldn't be more clear about both the threat of the Chinese Communist Party as well as the need to decisively defeat the Iranian regime. We're very proud to have him. Via a pre-recorded conversation I had with him on our television program, Securing America, on Real America's Voice. And we will go to the videotape with Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, former Chief of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet before his retirement, and now the driving force behind a tremendously important information sharing Google group called Red Storm Risen. Let's go to the video now.
I think it's obviously something of great concern. I think the president and his team are focused on trying to extend the Abraham Accords. So I'm not sure how that squares with these three nations being in a military, a cooperative alliance together. I think that the president's intentions may be correct. He's looking for something that would be good, but as you point out, there's a lot of risk here. When you look at the Turks, they have aspirations back to the Ottoman Empire, so they remember those days. They want to be a major player in the region. They have had historically very bad antagonistic attitudes towards Israel. So obviously Pakistan does, and Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accords have softened that on our perception of that, but it's still a very dangerous region. I'm not sure where this is going to go. I'm not sure if it's going to be effective. We can look at the memorandum of understanding that we signed or had with Iran, and that lasted, not very long. So a lot of these agreements are temporary in nature, so we need to be making sure that we're not putting ourselves at risk. And at a strategic perspective, we count on this region for a lot of things, and one of them was transit. I was just reading some history that we just celebrated the 156th anniversary of the first U.S. Navy warship that transited through the Suez Canal in 1870, August 11th and 12th of 1870. And we didn't use it. We weren't sending that ship there to go guard oil refineries in the Persian Gulf. There wasn't any. We sent that ship through because we wanted it to go to the Far East to be on station in China, in the Asiatic fleet. And that was a quicker way and a more secure and safe way to send our ships through. So there's a lot of reasons that for strategic purposes that we want these choke points and areas to stay open. And we would hope that an alliance like this would not put those at risk. And what is China's role and involvement in this is something that needs to be vetted out as well. They have close ties with all of these nations. You could say in many ways that Pakistan for sure is a proxy of the People's Republic of China. The relationship between China and Turkey is close, and also with Egypt. We saw PLA Air Force new tankers, the Y-20 tanker, and refueling Egyptian MiG-29s here in the last couple of years. So the Chinese tentacles are everywhere, and their main purpose is to cause us unnecessary harm and diversion away from what we said is the main thing. They don't want us to be able to start pivoting to the Pacific as a nation. I think that's also what's probably pushing some of this diplomatic initiative on the administration's part, is that they understand that we have to be able to shift our resources, not 100% of them, but we have to start making that shift to the Pacific in order to prepare for what appears to be the Chinese envelopment and taking of Taiwan and all that would entail for our national security. So we have great challenges. We have challenges with Ukraine and Russia. We have challenges clearly in this area of the Middle East. We have challenges with China. We have Putin is just now in Itarup Island, north of Hokkaido, pressing the Japanese, our ally in the Far East. And you got North Korea launching two short-range ballistic missiles here in the last week. They're piping off as another proxy of China. So we're facing real existential threats, real military threats around the globe, and it should be informing and affecting our budgeting process and what we're doing as a nation to defend ourselves. And we can't just keep ignoring these threats and wishing them away.
That is for sure, Captain Fennell. We may not indulge in the delusion that we can wish these things away. We're going to examine, in fact, precisely why that is so in a bit more detail with one of our country's foremost experts on the Middle East. He is a grand strategist, more broadly, to be sure, but his specialty over decades of public service, both as a naval intelligence officer and as a senior official in the Departments of State and the National Security Council and the Office of the Vice President of the United States, has put him at the very pinnacle of policymaking in this arena, as well as understanding the complex and often very volatile dynamics of it. His name is Dr. David Wormser. In addition to all of that background, he is very much in the fight today at the Center for Security Policy, where he runs its Mideast program. He's been very active with us on both the Victory Coalition as well as, from time to time, the Committee on the Present Danger China, and we are very grateful for his participation live, which makes this all the more important. Dr. Wormser, thank you for your joining us once again. The floor is yours, sir.
You know, when you look at Middle Eastern alliances and so forth, there's sort of two levels. One is the physical level of what this brings to bear, what force multiplication is involved for each of the countries that joins this alliance, and who are they focused on. And then there's a second level, which is the political and geopolitical statement that it represents. It's aspirational, but it shows you the strategic direction that everything's headed. So let me start with the first level. The first level is straightforward. You have three countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. They form an alliance. There's certain elements they bring to bear to each other. For example, obviously now in that alliance, which contains Article 5 clauses, namely if an attack on one is an attack on all the rest, include Pakistan, and Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So all of a sudden, kind of there's a nuclear umbrella that is now extended over Saudi Arabia and Turkey. We know that that is most likely a certain unreal thing. I mean, I would not dismiss it, but we see, for example, Turkey is itself beginning to show signs of moving toward some sort of a nuclear aspiration. We saw one of the reasons in the last few days the United States has conducted this negotiation and extraction of the nuclear material from Syria, the Deir ez-Zohar, the nuclear structure that Israel bombed back in 2007. That was really a joint Syrian, North Korean, Iranian effort. There was some dangerous nuclear material there, and we negotiated its extraction. And one of the reasons we negotiated its extraction was the Israelis had picked up that the Turks were sending people there with the attempt to extract it themselves. So this tells you that the Turks have some aspirations beginning to emerge even on that, but that also tells you that they're not fully confident that they have all the access they would want to Pakistan's nuclear weapons. So what I'm trying to say is the force multiplication aspect of these treaties is limited. What matters more is the fact that it allows Turkey to deploy, countries that can deploy and have more power to project. It allows them to deploy ahead of time in a structure. In a war, Saudi Arabia could always ask Turkey to intervene, but Turkey's ability in the context of a war, with an emergency situation, to deploy 100,000 troops to Saudi Arabia to fight alongside Saudi Arabia is very limited. That very few countries in the world have that sort of force protection capability that the United States has so easily displayed all the time. Turkey does not, but Turkey is setting up bases all over the place, has more bases than the United States right now in the Middle East. And from what we can tell, this involves now the deployment of, and there are reports in the last few days, that Turkish air squadrons will deploy to Saudi Arabia. So we're seeing some military capability to this. But I would really focus less on that because the history in the Middle East of these alliances is somewhat checkered. What's more important is what the strategic context of this is. And it shows that our policy in the region is grounded on obsolete and, quite frankly, dangerous assumptions because they're obsolete. With Pakistan, obviously the primary enemy for Pakistan is India. The second element of Pakistan is because they're in such conflict with India, they've had a traditionally very close relationship with China. So that's point number one. So there's already an element here of Chinese involvement and a certain anti-Indian element to it. The second element is Turkey. Turkey, we're not noticing, but they're working with China to cobble together the Turkic nations of Central Asia into a belt that connects them to China. It has a certain economic aspect to it, but it is really more than that. It's the Chinese Belt and Road on the Turkish end. It's a strategic axis that is anchored or welded on top of a trade or transit axis. And now the Turkic nations in Central Asia aren't that happy about it. They don't necessarily, just because they're Turkic, want to follow Turkey. And there are some tensions surrounding that because Turkey is Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of these nations are not. And Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is this dangerous ideological current that seeks the destruction of the West. And some of these countries, like Turkmenistan, I'm not sure about, but Kazakhstan and so forth, they're not so big on that. But nonetheless, this is the strategic game Turkey's playing with China. So we have the Chinese angle to Turkey. The second element of the Turkish angle is India. We in the West have not paid attention to this, but the tensions between India and Turkey are very high, and they have been high for a decade already. When the Indian security services arrested agents of the Turkish intelligence structures trying to foment an uprising among India's Muslims. Now, remember, this is not in Kashmir and Jammu. Jammu and Kashmir, way up in the northwest, in an isolated area in the mountains on the foot in the beginning of the Himalayas. This is the 200 million Muslims that are in India. Now, we can only imagine what sort of a destabilizing force trying to encourage an uprising in a civil war that involves 200 million Muslims could involve. One just has to remember what happened in 1947-48, just with the partition, which both sides agreed to between Pakistan and India, which is really a Muslim-Hindu separation. 15 million people were refugees, 7 million were killed. I believe those, I would check up on that to verify, but we're in that ballpark of millions killed. So one can only imagine how bloody and deadly a civil war that Turkey was trying to foment in India could be. Now, of course, who does that help the most? It helps the Chinese. So what you're seeing is a coalition emerging between China and Turkey, which we look at Turkey as a NATO member. And our assumption of Turkey's strategic utility is obsolete. It's anchored to the Cold War. When Turkey was secular, Turkey was not informed by the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, it was anti-Muslim Brotherhood. And it anchored the southeast section of the NATO alliance to sort of outflank Russia, Soviet Russia, and separate them at least partially from the Middle East. The other partiality of that was, of course, Iran. So between Iran and Turkey, you essentially drew a line between the Soviet bloc and the Middle East. And that was a key strategic element. But and of course, Turkey was run by a government which looked to Europe. It put both feet in the direction of the West, toward Europe. And what happens now with Erdogan being informed by the Muslim Brotherhood, first of all, his feet are pointed to the East. His feet are pointed back to the Middle East. He sees the Middle East as the future of Turkey. He sees the reconstruction of the imperium of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East as his natural base, and his enemy, the one that he civilizationally wants to stay. He doesn't want to be part of Europe. He wants to essentially dominate Europe in an imperial sense, but also in an Islamic sense, which is why Turkey is the single greatest font of illegal immigration heading into Europe. It's a strategy. to undermine Europe. So what you see in Turkey is a fundamental strategic shift to being hostile to the United States and being strategically much more aligned now with China. Now that brings us to Saudi Arabia. What's the game here? I think in Saudi Arabia, they are frustrated with the United States. They wanted the United States to go all the way in this war. We didn't go all the way in this war. And they see the United States fickle. The old perfidious Albion that was the moniker for Britain in the interwar period among many of its allies who felt frustrated that they weren't stalwart and resolved in their leadership of a bloc. People hedged. And that's what you're beginning to see now with the United States. Fair or unfair, I'm not criticizing the president, but that is the perception in Saudi Arabia that the United States doesn't really know what it wants, doesn't want to deal with Iran, doesn't want to destroy Iran's regime. What's the relationship with Israel? They see a very powerful pro-Israeli sentiment. They like that actually because it shows America stands by its allies. But now they see the United States getting back into Obama era arguments with Israel over Gaza, over restraining themselves in Lebanon, over don't get involved with Iran because you're just going to burden us and it's going to cause us to be more, we're going to have to engage more seriously because the Israelis will break the dishes and go after the regime, and we'd prefer not to do that. It'll cause problems with our Arab allies. The language of the Obama era is re-entering the American political lexicon strategically right now. And the Saudis see that, and their reaction is, well, we know where that leads. So they're trying to figure out a way to survive. So the first thing they do is they reach out to their enemy. Now, we know Iran's their enemy, but Turkey was also their enemy. There was a Cold War in the Middle East between Turkey and Egypt on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other. So Turkey versus Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And it was deadly. Turkey took the side of Qatar against Saudi Arabia. Everywhere you went, there were signs of this Cold War, and the UAE was helping the Saudis. You saw it in Libya, you saw it everywhere across the Middle East and Egypt. What the Saudis are doing right now is they're surrendering. They're surrendering to their enemy, Turkey. But that also involves, first of all, aligning with Turkish strategic interests, which do involve this alignment with China. And the second thing is their other enemy, which is Iran. They don't count on the United States to deliver victory over Iran. They think they're going to be left holding the bag with a poked but not dead bear of Iran. So they now see themselves as exposed entirely to Iran. And they know they don't have the ability to convince Iran directly not to go after them. So what do? They go to Iran's patron, China, and they tell China, look, we're going to give you what you want strategically, oil at a reduced rate, strategic access to the region. We'll join this alliance with Turkey, and your strategic aims that are being executed or materialized through Turkey. We're going to join all that. We're going to give you what you want, but you have to help us. You have to essentially put the reins on Tehran, on Iran, and you have to pull them back and you have to protect us from Tehran. So they're looking to patronage from China now to protect them from Tehran. So what you see is a complete surrender of Saudi Arabia right now to its strategic enemies because it no longer feels it has the confidence of a backstop from the United States. That also now goes to North Africa, the final piece of this, and then I'll leave it at that, which is Egypt is in the same place, really. It is in the middle of essentially a Muslim Brotherhood takeover of the country. Sisi doesn't feel he really has the power to resist it anymore. It would lead to civil war, and he doesn't believe he has the rank and file, even of his military or security services behind him. So essentially, he's recognizing the fact that the Egyptian power structures are now effectively controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course anchored to Turkey, which was his arch enemy. So he too is beginning to cut a deal with Turkey, and you see it by bringing in Chinese troops to do joint exercises. You see it with bending Haftar, the proxy that Egypt had in Libya, against Turkish forces in Western Libya. all these now are bending, using a Catholic term, they're coming to Canossa. They're bending the knee to Turkey. And Egypt is beginning to strategically align with China and Turkey. The only problem Egypt has is twofold. One is that he needs to survive, and there's a lot of corruption, and the Muslim Brotherhood is not 100% on that. So he's still trying to cut the arrangement with the Muslim Brotherhood that allows him to survive, but Muslim Brotherhood runs the country on behalf of Turkey. The second part of it is I believe it's Article 6 of the peace treaty with Israel, that essentially that says that Egypt can enter into no structure that could potentially commit it to warfare against Israel. And given that this alliance with Turkey and the rhetoric from Turkey is quite clear about Israel, Hakan Fidan just today threatened Israel directly by saying if they don't give in to Turkey's vision of Gaza, then there will be an escalation against the tripartite alliance. So this is emerging as not only an Indian, but as an anti-Israeli alliance and an anti-UAE alliance, because the UAE is aligned with Israel, etc. And when Saudi Arabia surrendered, it threw basically UAE overboard. This is an anti-UAE Indian and Israeli alliance, and Article 6 of the peace treaty essentially prevents Egypt from joining without it becoming a major diplomatic crisis that could lead to an Egyptian-Israeli war. I think that's still in the future. But at the moment, Egypt, at least is hopefully, Egypt still remains out of that arrangement and seems to not yet want to join it. However, strategically, Egypt's already moving into that camp. We see, we discussed the Middle East, we discussed Central Asia, but North Africa and Africa overall is a major Chinese play. And this is where the Turks play such a huge role for China, is by taking over North Africa. And you're seeing Turkish bases in Libya, Turkish bases in the Sahel region of North Africa, just under the littoral, where the Wagner forces of the Soviets or the Russians are leaving, and a vacuum's creating. Turkey is filling that vacuum. Turkey is dominating via its position in Somalia, the Horn of Africa. And this is creating a strategic anchor, not only for Turkey all over North Africa, but China, which is now accessing the Great Lakes region to the south for all the raw materials. So you see basically an African takeover by China and Turkey that is anchored to that position in that core geography of Sudan, Horn of Africa, and Libya. So this is the strategic pressure on Egypt, and my sense is they are drifting slowly into that camp. And as a result, this is a strategic meltdown for the West. So that's a strategic context I wanted to lay out that I don't think we properly appreciate for this tripartite agreement in the Middle East.
David, what a comprehensive and formidable analysis. We're going to complement it next with another individual who has been a featured pillar, really, of our Victory Coalition programming. His name is Rabbi Pesach Walicki. Rabbi Walicki is the executive director of a remarkable organization in Israel, Israel 365 Action, a source of innumerable video analyses and other content. He disseminates through both the Israel 365 Action platform and YouTube. He is, in addition, a podcaster with Shoulder to Shoulder and a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. I had a chance to speak with him earlier today for the purposes of both contributing to our Securing America program as well as this webinar briefing. And we're going to go to the video with Pesach Walicki at this point. Thank you.
This defense pact is between three countries that have a history of not honoring defense pacts that they sign. We'll get to that later. I'm not saying that there isn't anything worrisome about this pact, but we have to take it all with a very big grain of Middle Eastern salt. In the initial reporting, the initial Reuters report about this pact when it was announced, it stated that there's no, there's no specifics on the commitments each country had accepted, and it's not clear how far their agreement would bind them. And they, in the statements that came out from the various governments right after it was signed, it was full of hedging, where they were saying, well, this isn't, there's nothing offensive about the, this is only defensive, it's not offensive, and it's not directed at any specific country. There was a lot of hedging going on. And it leads one to the question of what this pact actually is. Like, what are they actually committing themselves to? So that's one aspect of it. And that would, would bring us into any of the potential, minutia in the pact. But what you're pointing to is a larger issue. I still think it's a very dangerous thing. So number one, it's deliberately vague. Number two, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia actually already signed a mutual defense pact back in September 2025. So correctly understood, and I saw a few analysts who pointed this out, this is really Turkey joining the already existing Saudi-Pakistani defense pact that already existed. Now, the reason that's significant is that since the signing of the Saudi-Pakistani defense pact, which was supposed to be kind of like NATO Article 5 style mutual, mutual responsibility, that if, one is attacked, both are attacked. That's what it was supposed to be. And Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, after they joined this three-way pact, made a point of stating that this is just like NATO Article 5. He wanted to say that. But from the end of February, when the United States and Israel launched Epic Fury or Roaring Lion, depending on which country's name you choose, ever since they launched the war against Iran, Saudi Arabia has been under attack by Iran intermittently, more intensely earlier in the war. Pakistan never lifted a finger on their behalf. On the contrary, Pakistan was aiding and abetting the Iranians. We know that they sheltered Iranian aircraft during the war from American attacks. They aided and abetted the Iranians and still do in breaking the blockade by opening up more and more overland trade routes, and they're continuing to help Iran. So the fact that they have a mutual defense pact with Saudi Arabia meant absolutely zero during the course of this war, and yet they're now signing this other pact. So this is what I meant when I said that it's not clear what it actually will mean in practice. We should also take a look at what just happened in Turkey the other day. A couple days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, was in Turkey for a state visit. And Erdogan and Abbas, it didn't get a whole lot of coverage. You might have seen some coverage of it where people were just quoting this one line that Erdogan reaffirmed his support for Palestinian statehood. But if I took the speeches. Erdogan's speech was in Turkish, Abbas's speech was in Arabic, and I got them translated, and I read through everything they said. And Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, he pointed to this agreement between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, and said that this signals, the dawning of a new alliance of the Sunni world, of the Muslim world, and he was hailing it in the sense of it being part of Erdogan's neo-Ottoman ambitions. He didn't use those words, but both of their speeches were very much about how Turkey is now the patron of the Sunni world. So Turkey certainly wants to use this pact as a way of strengthening their positioning and being able to flex their muscles. But again, the history of defense pacts in the Middle East, and this goes back a long, long time, people just don't keep them. The Arab League had a joint defense pact starting back in 1950 that never actually functioned. In 2015, there was an Islamic military counterterrorism coalition with like 40 countries. It never did anything. There was then another, there's been over and over again, there have been these defense pacts that have never amounted to anything.
Let me ask you about this, though.
Sure.
I take that point that, these are scoundrels. There's no honor among thieves. But the point is, one of the things that I think is potentially operating here and is worrying is the extent to which the Saudis have historically, at least, for the past decade or so, viewed the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat to their, kingdom, to the ruling of the royal family specifically. The Turks are the Muslim Brotherhood at this point, and vice versa. Of course, joined by the Qataris in financing it all. If the Saudis are now saying they would like to be aligned with the Turks, however, ephemeral this might be, does that bespeak a shift in terms of an accommodation to the Brotherhood by the Saudis that is potentially of a more enduring problem, for one, and also possibly not just for the royal family, but others as well, including us.
No, I don't think it speaks to any kind of shift at all. The Saudis have, despite the fact that they officially banned the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's what you're pointing to, they also for years have been backing a Muslim Brotherhood militia in Yemen against the Houthis. Meaning they actually fund a Muslim Brotherhood group there. The Saudis have always played a double game with this Muslim Brotherhood stuff. Look, they don't fear the Muslim Brotherhood because they disagree with the Muslim Brotherhood's fundamental ideology. No. They banned the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood sees all Arab governments, all independent state governments as illegitimate, and they view the Saudi royal family as illegitimate, and they're worried that the Muslim Brotherhood will destabilize. That's where we have to look if we're going to bring in the China piece, because even though all of these three countries, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, all have working relationships, let's say, with the Chinese, with Pakistan is at a different level. The Pakistani government is in significant debt to the Chinese. I think something like around a quarter of Pakistan's national debt, or what they owe to the Chinese Communist Party. When I mentioned before that they opened overland routes into Iran to break the Trump administration's blockade, the American blockade on Iran, that was really at the behest of the Chinese. The Pakistani foreign minister actually said, Ishaq Dar, he actually said out loud a few months ago that when they proposed, when they worked as mediator, getting that first ceasefire and then working as mediator between the Americans and the Iranians, he said out loud on the floor of the Pakistani parliament, in Arabic, of course, that every move that he made was coordinated with Wang Yi, the foreign minister of the Chinese Communist Party. Meaning the mediator between the United States and Iran was actually the Chinese Communist Party through their agent, Pakistan. Pakistan is kind of owned by the Chinese Communist Party. So if they're part of any deal, it is only with the rubber stamp, with the approval of the Chinese Communist Party. So we certainly have to view this through that lens. And that brings us to what I believe is the real target of this alliance, because I don't think it says anything specific to Israel. I mean, these are all countries that Israel has has bad relationships mostly with, but understands them, and they understand where Israel is. It's not going to change Israel's behavior. It's not going to change their behavior vis-a-vis Israel. I think it has a lot more to do with India, because all three of these countries view India as an adversary. Pakistan, we know certainly the history, but a lot of people don't realize that in the war that took place in 2024 between Pakistan and India, which was overshadowed by other wars going on, but there was a war, the Turks actually had personnel on the ground in Pakistan fighting with the Pakistanis against the Indians. A number of Turkish personnel were actually killed in an airstrike by India. There are very bad relations there. Turkey is very vocal about supporting Pakistani claims on Kashmir, meaning that's a long-standing source of tension. And we know, of course, that India's primary adversary, besides Pakistan to its west, is, of course, the Chinese Communist Party. So we certainly have to view it through that lens. And I think that this alliance was trying to isolate India a little bit more. Also, India has grown much closer to the state of Israel. Lost in the shuffle of the beginning of this Iran war is that 2 days before the war launched, Modi was in Israel, spoke in the Knesset, signed 16 agreements in various areas of trade and even defense and security with the Israelis. So there's a growing alliance between Israel and India, which the UAE is also a part of. The UAE is no friend of these three Muslim nations either. So I think there's definitely a signal in this deal that these countries are binding together in some way. But I'm going to go back to the caveat that I raised before. Deals like this never seem to get honored. It's one of the features of these dictatorships, these totalitarian mobsters, is that they don't keep deals. Look at China and Russia and Iran, who all had these mutual defense pacts also, and neither China nor Russia lifted a finger to help Iran, militarily during all the wars that Iran has been fighting over the last year, whether it's the 12-day war or this war. So I'm not so concerned that this actually will ever come to pass, and that NATO Article 5 type of commitments will ever be kept in a deal like this. I think it's more of just a flexing of muscles. There's also a signal to the Americans that the Saudis continuing to play their game of constantly drifting in and out of the American orbit and reminding the Americans all the time that they're not fully in their camp. I think that might also be part of this. It might be a signal to the Americans that regional actors here in the Middle East are no longer trusting American security guarantees. It's a way of trying to send that signal. It's not like the Saudis expect the Turks and the Qataris to really come to their aid. But let's also throw this in. Erdogan actually already has troops on the ground in Saudi Arabia. There are large numbers of Turkish troops that are in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family loves to have foreigners fight their battles for them. One of the features of these kingdoms in the Muslim world is that they're always afraid of coups. So they don't want their armies to be too big. So they prefer to have mercenaries or foreign forces come in and be the army for them because there's less chance of rebellion. So the Saudis actually have invited Turkish troops into Saudi Arabia already. So, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to look at this, Frank.
Sure. And we're going to be looking at them from one more perspective, that of Josh Hammer, a man of prodigious capability who has been active with us on the Victory Coalition front particularly, I'm very pleased to say, and a frequent guest of our the Securing America, I should say, program. In fact, we've got a clip from his most recent interview with us that we wanted to play for this purpose. But before we do, let me just say he's a columnist, I believe, for Newsweek. He is an attorney by training and counsel to the Article 3 project with Mike Davis. He is a podcaster and television host of his own program, the very, I think, important Josh Hammer program. And one of the people who has most astutely understood the connection between the fate of Israel and that of civilization more generally. It turns out that Israel's enemies are seeking the destruction not only of the Jewish state, but of course of ours, I think without exception, and that of Western civilization more generally. So a man of many parts. We had him on the show recently, and we're, with his permission, going to use a snippet from his conversation with me for today's program as well. Let's go to that now.
So it's definitely concerning. I have seen some folks who are trying to spin this as a major achievement. Some folks are trying to say of Trump's foreign policy. That's not how I see it. I've seen some folks, Frank, who are generally pretty solid, actually. So I actually saw Congressman Joe Wilson, I believe, of South Carolina, who's typically on the right side of Middle East issues. He was saying this was a formidable accomplishment of Trump's statesmanship and foreign policy. That's not really quite how I see it, to be candid. Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan is emerging as perhaps the single most problematic actor in the entire Muslim world, which is a really strong statement given the fact that that title's been held by Iran for the past 47 years, more or less. But in some ways, it seems to me that Iran is actually on the decline. Regardless of how this current operation ends, they have taken one on the chin. Their broader network, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, etc., their proxies are not as formidable as they were as recently as 3 to 5 years ago. Turkey really is the ascendant Islamist power in the region. And they're not just a Muslim power. They are an Islamist power. Erdogan is just as, if not more prolific than his co-religionists, his contemporaries in Doha and Qatar when it comes to financial sponsorship of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood worldwide, when it comes to promotion, dissemination of their toxic ideology, and just fan the flames of at times violence. To say nothing, of course, of his horrific authoritarianism at home. Turkey is the number one jailer of journalists in the entire world per capita, just to give you an example. Pakistan is a country that has a myriad problems of its own. They've been exposed numerous times. They've been trying to have this whole mediation role, trying to mediate between the United States and Iran since Epic Fury was launched with the decapitation strike on February 28th. And it turns out that Pakistan, we now know, has really been talking out of both sides of their mouth. They actually were hosting some Iranian military aircrafts. Pakistan is very, very close to Iran. Pakistan, going further back, I think Americans will not forget, was actually where Osama bin Laden was hiding. And the Pakistanis, who were ostensibly America's ally at the time, were more than aware of that. So I think it's very problematic. And Saudi Arabia is the big kahuna in the entire Muslim world, because they're the custodians of Islam's holy sites. The Saudi Arabian piece, Frank, I'm not entirely sure what to make of it. To be candid, Trump seems to get along very well with Mohammed bin Salman, and I was optimistic after. So let's go back to the Biden administration. During the Biden administration, the Saudis actually welcomed in China to expand their Belt and Road initiative there in the Arabian Peninsula. But when Trump came back, I was optimistic that the Saudis would stay within the American sphere of influence in this U.S. versus China great power competition. That's really the name of the geopolitical game this century. And for a time, it looked like that was going to happen. So when Trump went to the Gulf in May of 2025, he got these massive investment pledges from Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, etc. But I think that a lot of these countries are quite skittish now, because they have seen America's, shall we say, at times schizophrenic approach to the current conflict with Iran. So they're hedging their bets. They're hedging their bets on America's staying power in the region. And unfortunately, given China's immense ties to Pakistan is in some ways basically a satrapy at this point of Beijing. So given China's immense ties to Pakistan, and their slightly less intense but nonetheless existent ties to Saudi and Turkey, yeah, I think there's potential to be real concerns here. I don't actually really know what's happening currently in Riyadh. It's very hard to tell, frankly. A lot of the reports that I read seem to indicate that on the one hand, bin Salman was egging on Trump to finish the job, to go hard. At one point, just over the past month or so, it looked like the Saudis actually were teaming up with the United States on airstrikes on Iranian militias operating in Iraq. And then on the other side, out of the other side of the mouth, yes, they are teaming up with Erdogan, who is the number one or number two funder of the Brotherhood, the same Brotherhood that is ostensibly banned within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So it's very hard, frankly, for me at least, to figure out what exactly is currently going on with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But it's not great. It's not great that they are allying like this with Turkey and Pakistan, which are both very problematic countries. China is America's biggest enemy of the century. There is no doubt about that. I like to joke on my own show, Frank, that China is our first, second, third, and fourth gravest threat this century. And yeah, I think that there is something to be said for this red-green alliance, this Marxist Islamist alliance, happening not just here in the United States, where it's definitely happening. That's Mamdani, Al Sayed, et cetera, but now it's happening, it seems, to an extent, on the geopolitical chessboard, with the biggest communist country in the world, the most formidable one, the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, and then this new axis of Pakistan, India, and Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. So there's potential very much to be concerned.
There is reason to be concerned. I think that's the takeaway from all four of these very important presentations. I'm delighted that we still have, I believe, Dr. Wormser with us, and I would like to summon him forward for a bit of Q&A with me. I want to start with a proposition. And the trouble with history, of course, is that when you're in it, you may not recognize that it's being made around you. And I think this may be one of those times. Obviously, there have been enormous dynamic developments in the Middle East in the past 2 years, and more are in the offing, I think it's fair to say. But David, one of the things you and I have talked about on and off air that I'm interested in exploring here is this nexus between the Chinese Communist Party and bad actors in the Middle East, including bad actors that we are insistently told are actually allies, NATO and major non-allies, for that matter. And I'm wondering because for quite some time, as I think I mentioned earlier, our Committee on the Present Danger China has been describing Xi Jinping as a strategic arsonist. This is just a manifestation of perhaps the game of Go that he's playing, or chess, or what have you, but that part of the game is to use the opportunity to ignite sparks and fan them into conflagrations that have two basic purposes. One is to perhaps advantage their allies in interesting regions, but also perhaps to simply create conditions under which their enemy, which is us, according to them, is subjected to, the diminishing resources, both financial and military and otherwise economic and geostrategic, to engage in the conflict or deterrence of it that Xi ultimately has in mind in the Pacific theater and perhaps elsewhere. My point is this, David, could what we've just been discussing in terms of maybe, yes, a marriage of convenience, maybe just another temporary, mutual defense pact that is of no enduring importance, but nonetheless suggests that, as I think you were contending, American power is on the wane in the Middle East, and there's a vacuum to be filled, and China, with its friends, intends to do that. That could move us further in the direction of what I think of as World War Xi, and make more likely the seizing of the day that Xi seems to be poised to do vis-a-vis Taiwan and perhaps other friends and allies and interests of ours, including maybe even us, possibly even here at home at the same time. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, no, absolutely. I think it's well said by you right now. That's there's a misperception that strategy is a military question, and I think in this context there are military elements to strategy always, and we can look at the military structure of this alliance, but there are other major elements of strategy here that are, for example, cultural capital. Does your nation possess the cultural self-confidence? And what we see is in a Middle East context, I mean, we're not going to get into here in this panel now about the attack on American culture in America by agents of China and using Hollywood and other things. But the Iranians said the quiet part out loud in 1979 when they called Israel the little Satan and America the great Satan. There was an understanding already the Soviet Union had in the Cold War that the war between Israel and its neighbors was a proxy war representing and symbolizing and embodying the larger world war that was raging at the time in the framework of the Cold War, which is why for the Soviets, it was critically important to move in to take over Arab nationalism in 56 after the 56 war. It was critically important for the Soviet Union to leverage the Palestinian issue and create the PLO and Palestinian nationalism in 64 as the anchor for its more global focused non-aligned movement, decolonization, not decolonization strategy, but exploitation of decolonization, to link up with what happened in Vietnam and Algeria and so forth. It was also important in 67, did not end very well for the Soviets, so they re-engaged and started pouring weapons in 1970, in the war of attrition, 67 to 70, also failed. So they put a lot into the 73 war, and the 73 war was a major event in the Cold War, as then later was the 82 war, because the 82 war both took care on one level of setting the stage for the technological proxy war between the Soviets and America, with Israel's taking out the whole air defense system of Syria and so forth in the Bekaa Valley, but also destroying the non-aligned movement decolonization strategy of the Soviets. So all along, the Soviets understood that the Arab-Israeli was at the core element of the larger global Cold War, that the Iranians then marched in, and of course derived in part from that cesspool of Soviet politics and Soviet subversive warfare. The Iranian Revolution emerged from some of these structures. And of course, they said the quiet part out loud, that Israel is part of the satanic structure that they're going to destroy. And the Chinese are being very careful not to say that, but in point of fact, that is what we're seeing. A world war waged in the region against America's key allies, of which Israel ranks very high. But India is emerging as a major strategic asset of the West. We're not really an ally with them, but we should be. And so you're seeing the great effort now being made to destabilize that. You're seeing the effort being made to destabilize American allies everywhere, whether it was Saudi Arabia, whether it was Egypt. So all along, China has been waging this subversive warfare in the Middle East, against Western cultural capital, civilizational alliances. And at the core of it, the most dangerous one is Israel, because there is no extraction of the resurrection of Israel from the foundations of Western civilization. It is who we are. We are a Christian nation. Our Christianity has its anchor and roots in the ancient history of the Jewish people. We were conceived in 1776, really before, in the entire colonial enterprise as the New Jerusalem. So, of course, if they can destroy the old Jerusalem, they destroy a core element of Western civilization. And that's why China's aligned, being a secular, anti-religious, communist structure, with the Muslim Brotherhood, a religious structure, because at the core of both, first and foremost, is the imperative of destruction of the West and the imperative of the destruction of Western assets in the region. First and foremost are the cultural aspects, the image of America, the credibility of America, the stature of America, but then most importantly, the civilizational roots of America that lie in Christianity, whose cradle is the Middle East and is deeply intertwined with the resurrection of Israel, even on a strategic level, with the minorities that are struggling to survive now and increasingly seeing Israel as their only ally to help them survive in Lebanon and other areas. So the military aspect of this alliance is very concerning on many ways, but to me, much more concerning is that the Chinese, through this alliance, are really taking the ball, and now we're fighting a defensive war in our court, rather than on our side of the court, rather than taking it to them. And that is what this alliance embodies, in my view.
David, I think that's a most important insight. And again, I'm thinking a little bit more about the calculations in the mind of a guy like Xi, as to whether he's sufficiently changed the correlation of forces, as you know, the Soviets used to call it, to essentially give him the latitude that he seeks to take Taiwan one way or the other. And it may not be confined to Taiwan. It may be the Philippines. It may be even Japan, who knows? But this is the kind of thing we're very anxious to deter. And concern, of course, has been that being embroiled in the Iranian war and having lots of assets, including the poor Abraham Lincoln, um, dedicated on an extended basis to that region is perhaps further creating this appetite by Xi. And this deal might, I know it's not a perfect analogy, and I don't want to overstate the similarities, but I do think at some level, what is operating here is no more permanent, as it happened, than was the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. But what, during its short life, it produced was the worst international conflagration of all time, World War II. Could a marriage between these seemingly totally opposite ideologies, for want of a better term, the sharia-supremacists and their agenda driven substantially by the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, and the Chinese communists and their agenda on the other. And I just have to tell you, David, for the reasons that you've laid out, I think so well, and have others to varying degrees, this could just be a historical moment in which we see something that is wildly more devastating than was even World War II.
You're framing this perfectly. Look, what the Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement, I think really, which followed, by the way, the Munich Pact, there were a number of elements that were raised in that. One is it essentially allowed the Nazis to focus on destroying the West and invading not only half of Poland, but invading France eventually, which the West was seen to be unwilling to defend because of their pact with in Munich with Prague, against Prague, against Czech territorial integrity, and then the not Anschluss, but the eventual conquest of all of Prague. I think if you're drawing the analogy, and analogies are always a little dangerous, but I think this is actually a very apt analogy here. What we're really seeing is that this was a war, like really the 30s, had the not United States, but had the United Kingdom and France reacted resolutely in 36 to Hitler, World War II would have been very different. Had they reacted very resolutely to the threat to Czechoslovakia, it would have been very different. But they didn't. And that essentially teed up a world war. In this specific case, we are facing a situation where Israel acted last summer, and it was a devastating blow to China, not just to Iran, to China. And then Israel and America acted again last February, and it was a devastating blow for China. Now, why do I say that? The Chinese strategy is based on the correlation of forces, that simply they understand that their equipment may be a half generation slightly behind our equipment, but they are banking on the fact that a certain amount of quantity translates into quality, and their quality was nothing to sneeze at. And along come the Israelis, which attack Iran, which is a fairly sophisticated military. They look ridiculous, but they are a fairly sophisticated military in a country that is, 37 times the size of Israel, that is 12 times the size of its population, etc. And Israel, without losing an aircraft, devastates twice the entire reigning structure of the Iranian system, and the entire command and control structure of the Iranian system, and the entire air defense structure of the Iranian system. The Chinese looked at that and they were terrified, because if Israel can do it, America can do it. And if America can do it, then their whole calculation of victory, their whole concept of correlation of forces is thrown out the window. So in actual war, what happened last summer and last February did more to convince the world and China that it is useless to try to challenge the West militarily. However, the way the war ended in both last summer and now, which is pull the plug before victory, to not follow through, to see the West engage in a self-destructive, agonizing debate over the insurmountable costs of the war, when we're talking $1 a gallon gas and 17 of our best and finest that had to pay the price, but still for destroying one of our, if not one of the greatest ideological foes, certainly the country that has claimed more American lives than anybody else since Vietnam, to destroy them at that cost was really an astonishing thing nobody could have predicted. And yet, they're the Chinese seeing the old patterns of the United States that led us into a position of weakness in the Middle East. The Obama-type assumptions and policies reemerge in the war after, in the diplomacy afterwards. And as a result, the Chinese are taking heart now. They don't believe the West has the will to follow through. So again, since strategy is more than just military, the military was answered. They know in a direct confrontation, if we start first, if we preempt, we can essentially shut them down, and their great numerical advantage doesn't matter. But they see our will as waning, our ability to maintain our position as a superpower waning, our willingness to follow through on the initial attack with a going for the jugular as absent. And as a result, this moment in history, which could have turned into a counterfactual history of what would have happened in 1935, 36, 37 with the remilitarization of the Ruhr land and so forth, we were going one way where the West did it right this time, and now we've swerved and veered into the other direction, and the Chinese are beginning to think that actually, in terms of where it really matters, force, strategy, and will all combined, they have the upper hand. And that means it tees it up for exactly what happened in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, or what, frankly, led to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. Hitler knew he didn't have the power, but he saw that the West didn't have the will. And then he used it to take Czechoslovakia, take the Škoda works, take their whole industrial structure, which was the most advanced military structure in Central Europe at the time, add to it their economy, then go after Poland. Yeah. So really, it's a very apt analogy.
The other piece of this that you're deeply versed in, particularly in the Middle East context, but I think, again, you're a grand strategist with a global understanding as well. And I think most of us just don't think this way, but so many of the people that we're up against now are products of, if not fairly still close to, the life condition of subsistence societies in which the calculation of power, who has it, who's aspiring to get it, what the chances are they will, who will prevail if they try, and so on, are matters of life and death, day in and day out. You know, the old line about when the elephants are stomping around, the ants get crushed. Well, the little people can suffer immensely. And so their ability to sort of be attuned to these subtle changes in relative strength are very significant. And I'm just mulling if that's so, and the Chinese on their side of the world and the various jihadists on the other are making these kinds of calculations, as you and several are panelists. What I'm really trying to get at here is, in each of these cases, when they sense weakness, as you've been just describing, in the case of the jihadis in particular, they're canonically ordered to redouble the effort to make the infidel feel subdued, right? And I think this is true generally of thugs, certainly of the Chinese communists as well. So these even subtle perceptions can be highly consequential, can they not?
Absolutely. You know, we don't understand how good and graceful the American people are and how we don't believe power is inherently a moral purpose. Power is an instrument, and it's used wisely, it's good. If it's used out of bounds, it's bad. It's not itself a moral condition. For much of the rest of the world, it is a foundation of morality, or what is really the absence of morality. You go to Cairo and you compare it to New York, two cities who roughly have the same massive populations. Well, but New York is a nation of 16 million people, all of whom count. When you go to Cairo, a huge amount of the population doesn't really exist. I mean, they're living in the graveyards in the city of the dead because they have no houses. They live scrambling in the trash heaps to collect food and any belongings they need to survive. These are people who live at the edge. And in societies like that, power is what makes you matter. Power is what makes you a part of society. These others are living at the edge invisibly. So power becomes itself a major factor. But the second thing is the ideologies behind a lot of these movements demand absolute power. They're totalitarian. They seek to destroy society in order to build a utopia, and that involves a complete erasure of all individual power of any sort, and that attracts, I mean, I hate to say it, it attracts psychotic people. And then you look at Mao Zedong, and you look at Stalin, and you look at Nasser, and you look at Saddam Hussein, and you look at Khomeini, and you look at Hitler. You see psychotic people because for them, the ideology is a validating structure to exercise their destructive, controlling, manipulative essence. It's really it is their essence, and the ideology is the dress they wear to do it. And so you really, in much of the world, this is what we face, and we Americans who live in a very different world, which is we're fundamentally good people. Again, I said graceful people, tolerant, charitable. We project onto the rest of the world that most people are like us. And in many cases, they are not.
For sure. History is replete with the former being victims of the latter, and we risk it at our time as well, this historical moment. Yeah. I want to just say how much I appreciate the contributions everyone has made to this particular sort of hybrid program, part webinar of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, part briefing by the Victory Coalition, throughout, highly informative and insightful about a, yes, dynamic situation, but one that is potentially quite fraught. I want to thank Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, Dr. David Wormser, Rabbi Pesach Walicki, and Josh Hammer, barrister, for your respective contributions. They've been extraordinarily important and timely, and we look forward to regrouping with the rest of you a week or so from now. In the meantime, I hope you will stay well and that you will be doing your part by taking this information when it is available in a finished form shortly, thanks to our colleague Oleg Abashian, and also Justin Johnson of our Securing America program, to make it available to your circles of influence and otherwise bring it to the attention of people who represent you, ideally, and who have a need to know about the challenges that we've discussed and the importance for America of countering misperceptions and threats before they metastasize. With that, we'll say God bless you all. God bless America. Over and out.